All right. Welcome to the American Regulars Podcast, episode number 28. I'm your host, JD Walter. Follow me on Twitter at reg_American1 or email me if you need to talk to me. Get a hold of me at AmericanRegularspodcast@gmail.com. Wherever you're listening, know this. You can now also follow me on YouTube. The YouTube channel is American Regularis. And subscribe, tell your friends. Let the world know just how great this show is, right? Today, episode number 28, it might be a little abridged. And I personally know some of the people who listen to this podcast. And so for those guys, abridged means shorten. And it might, who knows? I have the ability to ramble. Maybe it'll be as long as ever. But I have a little less in terms of topics planned for today. Been a busy week. I've got a big weekend ahead of me. But I'm still going to try to deliver. There's been a lot going on. Most recently, a lot of podcasts for Tenet Media, podcasts, YouTube channel shows, whatever you want to call it. Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, Lauren Chen, who I'm very much the least familiar with, but I guess she kind of oversees the whole rodeo. She's kind of the big clown of the rodeo, whatever. They've been indicted or accused of getting paid by the Russians. That only makes sense. I'm actually not talking about that today. This is actually something I'm talking about maybe next week or something if it progresses more. I'm just telling you about some of the stuff we're not covering, but I don't think it should be too much of a surprise that this is happening. Election season, it's like right now it's football season. And with football season is like, it's like the best time of year for just like a good, like a Märzen, like a good Oktoberfest beer, like just a good malty lager. I think those two just go together. Election years pair really nicely with information about how Russians are ruining the election. You just can't have one without the other. It's like peas and carrots or peanut butter and jelly or beer and football, whatever you want to call it. They just go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other nowadays. Maybe we'll talk about that next week. I wanted to talk a little bit more about an article that I saw popping up on Twitter a lot, and I saw a lot of people poo-pooing it for good reason, and I saw a lot of people scoffing at it for, again, good reason. But I mostly saw people criticizing the title of this article. It was a New York Times article, so you know it's probably not going to be the best, which is weird because I know for so long the New York Times was supposed to be kind of the standard bearer of good pieces, good articles, right? It was supposed to be revered, and now most people look at it as a mouthpiece for the state, or at least for the left. This article was titled, "The Constitution is Sacred. Is it also dangerous?" And, I mean, everyone that saw the title pretty much gave it a pretty good ribbon right away, but I didn't see a lot of people actually commenting on what the bones were and the meat and potatoes portion. So I thought I would do you guys the favor of reading it so you wouldn't have to. And we're going to break down what exactly this argument is. And to preface on this title about it being sacred, I do detest when we hear so often people using government terms talking about it being sacred. They say it with democracy. Your sacred right to vote. And I think democracy is highly overrated. I think the right to vote is one of your least important rights. But I feel like they really like to propagate the notion that that idea is the most important because it does so little. Your other rights that are so much more important, they try to strip you from. You know, we constantly see attacks on the calls for gun bans or calls for media censorship. The big ones they go after all the time, but they're always in favor of how sacred your right to vote is. They never once go after that. I mean, honestly, they try to give it to people that don't even have the right, right? So, right away, it's not a great start for me because I don't like them using the word sacred because I think the state is anything. If it's anything, it's not holy, right? So this was, I'm gonna be critical of this article. I don't mean to mispronounce or denigrate this lady's name, but it was written by a lady named Jennifer Szalai. I think it's Hungarian. Szalai. Whatever it is, I can't pronounce it. Shizley. All right. So we're going to read this. I'm not going to read the entire article. I'm going to read a fair amount of it and kind of break down what she thinks and what I think of what she thinks. And it'll be a fun little exercise. We've been doing a lot of current events lately, but every once in a while, it's good to go back. I mean, history is kind of my bread and butter. And so when we go to something like the Constitution, which for America is old, right? 1787, sometimes it feels like I'm a little more in my wheelhouse than trying to just comment on the happenings of the day. Okay, I'm going to read and we'll just go through it. The United States Constitution is in trouble. After Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, he called for the termination of all rules, regulations, articles, even those found in the Constitution. I'm not sure what she's talking about there. Outraged critics denounced him for threatening a document that is supposed to be sacrosanct. Here they are already. And to some extent, it is usually the right that says that the Constitution or the Bill of Rights is sacred or sacrosanct or something, where as the Democrats usually preach on about democracy. By announcing his desire to, and by the way, both ones of those, the right disrespects the Constitution, the left doesn't do democracy. So, all right. By announcing his desire to throw off constitutional constraints in order to satisfy his personal ambitions, Trump was making his authoritarian inclinations abundantly clear. It's no surprise, then, that liberals charge Trump with being a menace to the Constitution. But his presidency, they're all menaces to the Constitution, Trump included, I'll give him that. But his presidency and the prospect of his reelection have also generated another very different argument, that Trump owes his political assent to the Constitution, making him a beneficiary of a document that is essentially anti-democratic and, in this day and age, increasingly dysfunctional. So, the lady lets you know here, it's anti-democratic, which... Fair enough. The Founding Fathers were skeptical of democracy for a number of reasons we'll get into later. And increasingly dysfunctional. I'm not sure how dysfunctional I don't know if you can grade whether the Constitution is dysfunctional or not in today's day and age, because it's not adhered to at all. But we do know they don't like it because it is the vestiges of state constraint. And we are... a train. I mean, we are all gas, no brakes, our government, right? There's no brakes. We're skidding off the rails. And so why would they like something that reminds them that they're supposed to actually adhere to some sort of rules? All right, moving on. After all, Trump became president in 2016 after losing the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College, parentheses, Article 2. He appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court in Article 3, 2 of whom were confirmed by senators representing just 44% of the population. So, we get to the meat and potatoes very quickly. This lady's gripe is the structure of the government set up in the Constitution. 1, that there's an electoral college, even though he lost the popular vote. And 2, that the senators that approved his Supreme Court justices, which she does not like, right, were confirmed by senators that only represent a minority of the U.S. population. Those 3 justices helped overturn Roe v. Wade, a reversal which most Americans disagree. So she's leaning very hard on what's popular vote. The eminent legal scholar Erwin Chemerinsky, worried about opinion polls showing a dramatic loss of faith in democracy, writes in his new book, No Democracy Lasts Forever. Let's talk about this. The popular vote in the Electoral College. What is her gripes with that? Well, simply put, the Republicans, when they win, especially recently, they often don't get the popular vote, but they can still win the Electoral College. Right? Because you get electoral votes per senator and per congressman, but all states get at least, they have the same amount of senators. So some states are overrepresented. I think I read an article like, if we went by popular vote, no electoral votes, like Wyoming's has 4 times the power it would if it wasn't a popular vote, just because of those 2 senators, right? So from this really base level first look at it, they just say this is not fair. It should be a popular vote. Just most votes wins. Plain and simple. And now because of that, Trump's in there, this electoral college. Because we don't like the results, it's automatically bad. The founding fathers, they must not have been thinking. Who would have done this? And then furthermore, these senators are not representative of the population, but representative of 2 per state. And so to be a confirmed judge, if the senators are from states with smaller populations, they might not be representing a majority. So this is all, what's funny is that, Trump would be considered the populist, if anything, and you hear a lot of people decrying populism nowadays, but this appeal is all about populism, right? All about majority, simple democracy, majority, mob rule. All right, later on, I'm going to skip here and there. I'll tell you when I skip. It goes on, talks about this Chemerinsky, and then at one point they say the argument that ails the country's politics isn't simply the president or Congress or the Supreme Court, but its founding document that presides over all 3. And that's been gaining, this thought has been gaining traction among liberals. Scholars argue that the Constitution has incentivized what Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt call a tyranny of the minority. So they're very mad that the tyranny of the minority, they're saying that their majority doesn't have the power they want. Obviously, the tyranny of the majority is a classically old problem with democracy, right? In a pure democracy, we've got 100 people on a pirate ship. We've got a democracy, and 51 of us, or 52 of us, just a very narrow margin, votes to make the other guy walk the plank. In a pure democracy, that guy is now out. It's the tyranny of the majority. Or if 52 people agree to take everybody with red hair, if we just take all their property, that's fine, right? The basic argument on republic versus democracy is republics have these laws put into place that protect the minority. You're set against it no matter how popular or unpopular. These laws are in place to protect rights. Ideally, that's supposed to happen. Sometimes they're there and they're just ignored. Case in point, U.S., right? But this was something that was supposed to ward against the tyranny of the majority, right? All right, I'm going to keep going. The anguish is in some sense a flip side of veneration. Americans have long assumed that the Constitution could save us, but there is now a growing chorus now wonders whether we need to be saved from it. Talks about the founding in 1787. 55 delegates convened in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. They weren't actually looking to make the Constitution. They were going to revise the Articles of Confederation, allegedly. They end up embarking on a project that was much bigger in scope. As Americans are taught in history class, the delegates drafted a new document establishing a national government consisting of 3 branches: legislative, judicial, executive, each functioning as a check on the others. The delegates were all white, and they were all men, but they nevertheless diverged on what they deemed to be an intractable issue: slavery. So it's all white men, the source of all evil. We know that. It's just like crystals or something in a sci-fi movie. It's the Ring of Sauron, right? Is that what it's called? The One Ring in the Lord of the Rings. It was made out of angry white men. Right? That's where all evil comes from. Though several states had already passed abolition statutes against slavery, nearly half the delegates were slaveholders. The Constitution was thus born of compromise, with the enslavers getting the better end of the deal. To determine representation in the House of the Electoral College, the 3/5 compromise allowed slave states to count 3 out of every 5 people held in bondage, none of whom, needless to say, could vote. And the Fugitive Slave Clause stipulated that even when enslaved people escaped to free states, they would not be set free. I believe that law, thankfully, the latter, was it was in place, it was there, but I think that was one of those laws that they overlooked, and they generally try to. I could be wrong on that. I hope they were right on it. But okay, going back to the Three-Fifths Compromise, it's kind of important to notice this is a real political thing. The Three-Fifths Compromise, right? They said, okay, to figure out how many representatives you get, we need to count people. And the Confederates said, well, we got a bunch of slaves. We would like to count those as people. And a lot of people think that, like, the South said, hey, we only want them counted as 3/5 a person. It's actually, they wanted them counted as a whole person, even though they would deny them rights or citizenship. They wanted them counted as a whole person to get more representation. Now, the Union might have argued, and this is the compromise, no, they don't count as people. But I think the abolitionists had a little bit of foresight, and yeah, it's ugly. They're considered 3/5 on this bill. But if you said they're not, to give them no personhood, to give them no value of representation, you're almost implicitly stating in an amendment or in the Constitution that they aren't people. And so by even giving them 3/5 or something, it's kind of like, hey, down the line, we can say, hey, we didn't say they weren't people. We might not have valued them equally, which they should have. But if they did value them equally, then the South would have had even greater representation. So there's a little political wheeling and dealing there. It's kind of this, it's politics. It's just dishonest stuff. It's just play with words. It's lawyer shit. But the North was trying to negate the South from having too much power electorally, while also not trying to handcuff themselves down the line when the issue of abolition would be raised. Such compromises meant that those who shared overlapping politics could still draw wildly different conclusions from the Constitution. The abolitionist William Garrison considered the compromise so damning as to make the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, but Frederick Douglass maintained the opposite, that slavery in the United States could only be upheld by claiming that the Constitution does not mean what it says. And there's others that say this, like Lysander Spooner was a great abolitionist. I really like his stuff. Obviously, as a libertarian, he's one of the OGs of anarchy. As a historian, James Oak put it, Douglass shared Abraham Lincoln's view, recognizing the Constitution the promise of universal freedom. I'm not sure that was Abraham Lincoln's view until it was time for it to be. Promise of universal freedom, yes, but also instructions. Let's go forward a little bit. The distrust of democracy embedded in the rest of the document, reflecting the framers' inability to conceive of a future when women and black people would have a right to vote. The legacy of this history is a stubborn ambivalence. Is the Constitution supposed to be a guarantor of human equality, or for society with a profoundly inegalitarian origin story, is the lofty principle just hypocritical cover? All right, there's a lot to go over with that. I'll say that again. Is the Constitution supposed to be a guarantor of human equality, or for society with a profoundly inegalitarian origin story, is the lofty principle just hypocritical cover? It is somewhat inegalitarian. First off, it's a government. All governments are oligarchies. Even the ones founded under the best principles, such as you could argue, and I would, the United States. I mean, it was founded in a much better way, or at least with much better intent than most governments, for all the good it's gotten us. But all governments are oligarchies. There's a natural inegalitarian measure just to creating a state in and of itself. So I'm not sure what that's about. A guarantor of human equality, it did not guarantee human equality. It said equality under the eyes of the law. That was supposed to happen. It does not. And definitely has not always, right? We can agree with that. But what did it guarantee? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and I would say property, right? Now, it didn't guarantee that to slaveholders slaves and women, so forth. As far as the distrust of democracy, yeah, Alexander Hamilton, who the left lauds today, was very skeptical of democracy, and he was not alone in that. Many of the founding fathers were very wary of democracy. One of the reasons they were very wary of democracy is because they read history, and they knew the great many problems that arose. There were democratic instances in obviously ancient Greece, and every one of them, you see things like the tyranny of the majority, right? As you read Madison, Jefferson, whoever, it becomes abundantly clear that they knew that welfare states and trying the issuance of money or access to things would be an inevitable thing from democracy. They were very skeptical of that. And I think your average person thinks that elections in America were always the same. They weren't. We used to have the electorate for president was usually very different. You elected a person from your state, you voted for another person, and it wasn't party politics early on, right? You weren't going for a popular vote to figure out where the electoral votes went. You had elites, essentially, that were the presidential electorate, and they would choose a person from their state, person from another state, and then if it didn't reach the proper number, a majority, which it never really did for a long while, then it would go to Congress to decide who would be president. And that wasn't some whoopsie-daisy. They designed that. They weren't a fan of this idea of the popular vote, and I don't think the popular vote thing really happened until like Andrew Jackson, where that started to happen, and political parties start becoming a bigger and bigger thing, which George Washington warned us on. And now you look at it and you look at the money and the corporations that lobby behind them and these platforms and the groupthink. I'm not saying that it's ideal to have elites. Now, the elites couldn't be in the Congress that voted for the president, though it would generally then go to the Congress if there wasn't a clear, like a majority. Like, I think George Washington was a shoo-in, and then after that, I don't think it happened very often. I think Jefferson, his second term, was elected without having it to go to Congress. But this was a very different process than what it is today. And it was done so for a lot of reasons. And not everyone could vote back then. Blacks couldn't vote. Women couldn't vote. People without land couldn't vote. This was all a safeguard against people trying to expand the government for very high time preference things, for wanting stuff for them. What can I get? What have you done for me lately? What can I get? What can I get? This was a bulwark against that. This democracy, you can call it egalitarian. It is, in a way, that if everyone can do it, but then we say, well, it needs to be more egalitarian. Maybe we should lower the age. It needs to be more egalitarian. Maybe we shouldn't have to show ID. It needs to be more egalitarian. Maybe we should let amnesty to 11 million people or whatever they're talking about now. And it becomes a slippery slope. And to hear tell, this automatically, the more numbers it is, somehow automatically makes the results better, which is just farcically illogical and unreasonable. She also goes on. I'm not going to read on this part because this podcast will be longer than without it. It's a longer article. She also goes against originalists. Originalists, another part of the Constitution, is the problem with the Constitution, basically what this lady goes on to say, is that some people read the Constitution the way it's written. These are called originalists. And damn it, if that doesn't handcuff you, because the Constitution was written very specifically to limit what the government was able to do. Okay? The other people, besides the originals, would be like what we'd call activist judges. And activist judges, if you ever hear this, like, hey, the Constitution is a living, breathing document. And as soon as something sounds dumb, a lot of times it is. When they say it's a living, breathing document, it means, hey, things change over time, and we need to be able to interpret this as loosely as possible. So things that were clear and concise, we're going to muddy the waters, and we're going to put nuance and context to it in whichever way we want so that we can say what they actually meant, or in this case, we can circumvent so we can now do what we want. And this gives a ton of power to the judicial branch, and an alarming amount. Cases like Marbury versus Madison, where they're able to just, we can say if it's unconstitutional or not, and we can change the wordings, and we know what the founders, not only what they were thinking, but what they would now be thinking if they were given this case. Well, there's a problem with that. The founding fathers knew that there would be stuff that was unforeseen. So there was a process where you could amend the Constitution if need be. But that's Congress. That's the legislative branch. That doesn't do the judicial system a darn look of good. And so the activist judges want to be able to interpret however they want, and now they can get stuff moved around, right? Now they can say that the executive branch has this much more power. It's been a terrible thing. So this lady so far, her gripes are that smaller population states are overrepresented, and we'll get back to that in a second. And then this the fact that this activism judging stuff isn't always flying with people. All right. She goes back to the consequences of Constitution worship. The Electoral College, of course, is one of the, this is her talking or writing, is one of the bargains the framers made in order to reassure the slave states that they could keep their own peculiar institution. Abolishing the Electoral College has become a popular refrain among liberals, something that the legal scholar Aziz Rana counts as one of the most procedural specifics that consume discussions about constitutional reform. Goes on to talk about his book. Let's read something I have highlighted down here. Constitution worship is so habitual that it's tempting to assume the veneration was baked into our politics from the very beginning. The disempowerment, there's another part down here. The disempowerment of majorities combined with political gridlock and institutional paralysis outside the judiciary fuels popular disaffection. The document that's supposed to be a bulwark against authoritarianism can end up fostering cynicism that helps authoritarianism grow. Okay. Okay, that's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. I don't know what she's saying there. Here's the thing about why the Electoral College is important. Okay? If you want to take a myopic view, more votes, you win. Well, that's fine. You can do that, but just realize you're not thinking this through. First of all, since the Civil War, we call it the United States of America. That's not what 1787 was. It was these United States of America. These were, each state was its own nation. This was a confederation of states under a federal republic. Okay? Now, for that to happen, once you look at it that way and say these were different states in a federal republic, it makes sense that one nation's or one state's people are voted, and then another state's people are voted on, and then they send representatives to the overriding thing. Now let's picture this from the European perspective, because we kind of see this now. The EU doesn't really have this, but imagine there was voting in the EU, and they said, well, the only true way for democracy to be perfect is a popular vote, right? So all the European Union countries go to vote on who's going to be the executive, right? I mean, this is not the European Union setup, but imagine it's more similar to the United States setup. Okay. The popular votes, let's say Germany, France, Italy, and UK. Let's say those 4 countries. If they can all agree in coalition and get on the same page, Estonia, and I'm not even sure who's all in the EU. I'm just going to name countries in Europe. Estonia, right? Lithuania, Romania, Andorra, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Netherlands. These guys are screwed every time. They don't have a population that can really swing it. Even if they put all these other guys together, those countries are big enough. This electoral process enables them to have a little bit more of a belly at the table. Okay, so what's so good about that? What if it's just pure vote, pure vote? Well, now they are disenfranchised. And so what the hell's keeping the Netherlands? What the hell's keeping the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? What's keeping Finland? Right? What's keeping all these countries in the EU on board? And don't quote me on who's in the EU or not. I don't know if Finland's in the EU. What's keeping all these guys there? Why would we stay in? We don't have proper representation, we just get bullied by Germany and France, the people with the populations. This is essentially what would happen to the flyover states from the coast, right? Most people live, California and the Northeast basically have so much people that they could bully not only, yes, a minority of people. If it's a direct, they would be the majority, tyranny of the majority. But now this small group of people this large group of people in a small group, in a small area of land, now gets to say what happens over the stretch of Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, this huge chunk with no people. These people that have nothing tied there, they get all the say over what goes on there. All those people are disenfranchised. Hey, we're going to take our ball and go home. We're going to secede. Of course, as you find out, they were supposed to be given the right to secede. They aren't. And so now what? You're risking war, right? And also, land is a precious resource. So while the flyover states, the Great Plains, and the Mountain West states, they may not have as many people, but people's not a nation's only resource, right? We're talking about oil fields, iron mines, gold, silver mines, agricultural land, okay? People is not the only metric that needs to be considered here for the integrity of a nation. Another thing is to think that this democracy thing, it's more democratic if it's just a straight popular vote. Maybe, but if you look at it that way, where all these different nations or all these different states just are in one combined vote, just one popular vote, that's just one election. All right? We have 50 states now, plus DC and territories, right, that get electoral votes. That's 50 different democratic processes. Okay, so what's more, a big one or 50 smaller ones, right? That more accurately represent a constituent of people. Again, I'm not arguing that it's perfect. I'm not a huge democracy guy. But there's plenty of reasons to take a little bit of a look at a direct popular vote and realize that it makes the state, look, you're the people who vote for it says the liberals are the ones that always push this, and it makes sense because they would win more. Okay. But if you're always going to win, which they would eventually, right? It tends to go towards the cities and the coasts, the liberal areas. They can win that popular vote all the time. Well, if someone loses all the time, they're going to take their ball and go home. And people are going to take their crops and their pastures and their mines and their oil fields, right? And they're not going to participate in this confederation. And then what do you get? Well, you either lose that part of the confederation, of the republic, right? The united part. You either lose them, or what? You kill each other? You go to war? We've done it. We go to civil war to keep them. Is that good? Is that better than land accounting, land and resources accounting towards some sort of weight in the election process as opposed to just numbers of bodies? And by the way, these bodies that are voting, some of them are just stupid as hell. I would have no problem if there were all sorts of stipulations that made you had to vote besides just age and a pulse. I mean, we don't even do ID laws anymore. So yeah, I think voting should be stricter in that regard. There's also other ways to do this too. There are, like the Swiss. I read this in an article by Ryan McMacken at Mises.org. I feel like I say that a lot, Mises.org. The Swiss have a process where it's a double, what do they call it? A double majority? So you have to have such a large percentage of the vote to become whatever the head of state is there. I don't know if it's president or chancellor or prime minister or whatever you want to call it. Let's, for Americans' sakes, call it the president. So in their system, you have to win so many states plus so much of the popular vote. It's a redundancy, right? That way someone can't just win all the votes from California. Let's say the political landscape changes and we win. Some president wins. California, New York, Florida, Texas, whatever the next biggest, Pennsylvania, Ohio. They win just the big ones, and then let's say you could win with 15 states, and then 35 are just SOL. Tough luck. 35 states didn't vote for you, but I got the popular vote. Nope, not enough. In the Swiss system, it's like you have to have 55% of the popular vote and let's say like 26 of the 50 states or 24 of the 50 states or something. I don't remember the exact percentages, but they say you have to have like a double plurality. Maybe it's not a double majority. Maybe it's called a double plurality. You have to have so much of the popular vote and you have to carry so many states. In Switzerland or Schweiz or whatever you want to call it, they're not states, they're called cantons, right? But smaller political entities. And by the way, then you could reduce this down to the state level, right? And the governor not only has to win, like a state like Nebraska. Let's say the whole state's red except for Omaha and maybe Lincoln, or then that's about it. But they might get a blue governor. Kansas has a blue governor right now, Democrat governor. When besides Kansas City and Topeka, maybe Wichita or whatever, the whole rest of the state's red. Okay, so it's not representing 80% of that state, 85%, 90% of that state, whatever. It might not be representing accurately. There's no perfect representation, especially in a two-party system. But if you had to do a plurality of votes, maybe people have to compromise more, or I keep using the wrong word, or a double plurality, right? If you had to carry so many counties plus such a plus a specific percentage, now you have this kind of redundancy. That's a better option, right? And then you can expand the electoral college in that way to where not I don't know. I think that's better. That's not necessarily expanding the electoral college. But that gives you a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, right? You can give a nod. Yes, popular vote matters. You can also sit there and say, but hey, we got to understand that these people with lots of land, maybe their stuff counts a little bit because that's a resource and they can't ever be properly represented and they just won't want to participate if that's the case. So it's a very flashy little headline for a New York Times article. It is also not deeply thought about. There's some quotes, but when it comes down to it, I don't really think this person gave it an honest, in-depth look or tried to ever really address too hard. And I know I didn't read the whole article, so go ahead and read it for yourself and see if I gave it a fair critique. I'm biased as the next person. This is not the news. When you listen to me, you're hearing my biased take, right? This is what I believe. So go listen, see if I represented it fair. I'm not trying to represent their case unfairly. I didn't read the whole thing, but I did read what I thought was kind of stood out. And then there's been some more abridgment just for time constraints. But it's mostly an appeal to the fact that they don't like the Electoral College. They wish they had the popular vote. They don't like that originalism denies progressives the ability to have these large overhauls. It fails to recognize minority protections. They talk this whole time about how it just should be like this majority thing. Majority. They even call it the tyranny of the minority. They don't realize that the whole thing was put in place to protect the minorities. That's like the benefit of the republic. It's not the minority they're necessarily thinking of, but all the same, it'll work itself that way one time or the other. The pendulum shifts on who's getting it. And they don't ever recognize that the electoral process was designed for 50 states that were working. Well, it wasn't 50 states at the time, but for a group of states that were going to be united as a federal republic, as a confederation of different states. She doesn't recognizes that. It's very not anachronistic. It's not really understanding any historical context on what was going on. She mentions it was made in 1787, but doesn't really approach it as the way that the United States was viewed at that point. Right? They went in to the thing was working, the Articles of Confederation. People weren't Americans back then. Generally, they were Virginians and Georgians and Connecticutians? What do you call someone from Connecticut? Let me know. Email me at AmericanRegularspodcast@gmail. What is a Connecticut person called? All right. That's all I've got in terms of that, but I like to try to leave you with, usually I like to put in one clip, maybe something a little more lighthearted. This was a pretty in-depth episode, and the abridged thing, for time-wise, doesn't look like I'm any shorter than usual. But Kamala Harris, our favorite, she was giving a bunch of speeches earlier this week, sometimes speaking twice in a day, and it must be taxing. I was reading my kid a book, Hank the Cow Dog, before I did this podcast, and I was kind of worried coming down here. This is ironic, but this is true. As I was coming down here, I was like, I've been doing this Texas drawl, or my attempt at a Texas drawl to be this cow dog, and like I kind of lay it on thick. It makes my kid like it more. And I was like, man, I hope I don't read this or start talking about this podcast and bring out this Texas drawl. I'm not a Texan by any means. I think that would sound cheesy to have an accent. That's not mine. That was an honest-to-God original thought I had as I came down here, even though I was planning on playing this part already. Here's Kamala Harris. The first one is her speaking in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The next clip will be her giving the exact same speech in Detroit, Michigan. All right? Now, hopefully I didn't sound like Hank the Cow Dog. Hopefully I wasn't trying to sound like some Texan. Let's see how Kamala did. Hopefully she's just Kamala being Kamala. Let's give a little listen.
Thank unions for sick leave. Thank unions for paid family leave. Thank unions for your vacation time.
All right. Thank unions for sick leave and vacation and family time. All right. Very good. Very good. Let's listen to the next bit and see if she probably sounds the exact same. I know they can get boring. We know we've heard Kamala sound the exact same earlier when she would say what has been, not be unburdened by what has been for the future, whatever that was. Let's hear her in Detroit, Michigan, maybe speaking to a different audience. I'll let you guys be the judge. Let's see if she sounds any different.
You better thank a union member for sick leave. You better thank a union member for paid leave. You better thank a union member for vacation time.
You better thank them. Lord, you better thank them. All right. I just, this is a really, really bright, colored, loud version of politicians just being fake. And I think that's why it's so fun, is because they're just basically all like that. Hillary Clinton trying to take a shot of whiskey with coal miners, and she's like, what is this? She's used to drinking whatever, Jeffrey Epstein's 50-year-old Pinot Noir or whatever, for all I know. All these people, they will pander and pretend to just be one of you. And whether, I don't know, is that the Detroit voice is hers? Is that how they speak in Montreal, where she grew up? Or was it Montreal? Wherever in Canada? Or maybe it's the Pittsburgh version. I don't know. But what we do know is she'll try to just pretend to be like you. It's very inauthentic, and this isn't... it's fun. It's fun to pick on her. It's not original to her. It's a very common thing that politicians do. Every one of them. They might not use the voice. They might not code switch or whatever the hell it's called. But every single one of them will be more than happy. Whatever it is that you're talking to them, they will nod their head and tell you how much they care about it. And guess what? Unless you're talking 9 times out of 10 about corporate campaign donations and fundraising activities. They don't give one rat's ass about it. All right. A lot about the Constitution. Like to end it on a little bit of a lighter note. Keep listening. Keep telling people. And we'll catch you later.